It all began on a quiet Tuesday morning that should have been uneventful. I was sitting on my porch swing with a mug of hot coffee, watching the sun peek through the clouds, when I noticed 3 people approaching my house. 2 men and a woman, each dressed in business casual, clipboards in hand and self-importance in every step. Leading the pack was Craig, the newly elected president of the Homeowners Association, a man I'd only interacted with briefly but immediately recognized as the type who gets drunk on even the tiniest sip of power. Without any greeting or courtesy, Craig announced that I was in violation of the HOA guidelines because of the storage shed I'd built in my backyard. He didn't ask to come in. He didn't offer any explanation. He simply declared that the structure needed to be removed within 72 hours or they would take corrective action. I blinked at him in disbelief, thinking it had to be a mistake. My shed wasn't some ramshackle eyesore. It was a solid, weatherproof structure made of pressure-treated wood, painted to match the house, with a shingled roof and locked doors. It had stood there for 3 years, tucked neatly behind a privacy fence, invisible from the road. I had even checked with the city before building it and got the proper permits. Yet here I was, being told by a man with a clipboard that my shed somehow violated the aesthetic uniformity standards of the neighborhood. When I asked to see the specific bylaw I had supposedly violated, Craig handed me a printout of a paragraph so vague it could have applied to anything from lawn ornaments to porch lights. All exterior structures must conform to the visual character and harmony of the neighborhood. No rule number, no official stamp. Just a generic statement printed from a word processor and held together with a paperclip. I couldn't help but let out a small laugh, thinking he must be joking. He wasn't. He doubled down, stating that non-compliance would result in further action, including potential fines and forced removal. I asked if I could appeal or have a hearing. He smirked and said, "We don't do appeals for clear violations." At that point, I knew I wasn't dealing with reasonable people. I was dealing with a petty dictatorship wearing the mask of community governance. So I did what any rational person would do. I ordered a Bodycam. A small, discreet one that clipped to my shirt like a pen. I figured that if these people were going to wage war over a shed, I'd better start documenting everything. What I didn't realize at the time was that this Bodycam would end up capturing not just harassment, but also trespassing, vandalism, and a string of illegal actions that would eventually give me the upper hand. Within 48 hours of their visit, I began receiving daily notices taped to my door. One claimed my lawn was overgrown, it wasn't. Another said my mailbox was not consistent with neighborhood design, it was the same black box it had been for 6 years, and one particularly absurd notice accused me of leaving my garbage bins out too long, even though I had rolled them in the same evening as always. It was clear that this wasn't about the shed anymore. They were targeting me personally. Maybe because I didn't vote for Craig, or maybe because I had the nerve to ask questions when everyone else stayed silent. Either way, it was harassment, plain and simple. But while they escalated, I documented. I recorded every visit, photographed every notice, and started digging into the HOA's public records. That's when I discovered something that made my jaw drop. Craig and 2 other board members were serving illegally. According to the bylaws filed with the county, HOA board members were limited to 2-year terms, and elections had to be held at an open meeting every 2 years. But Craig and his cohorts had skipped the last election entirely and simply declared themselves re-elected by unanimous consent. No vote. No notice. Nothing. Even worse, they had quietly amended several HOA rules without the required quorum, making up policies on the fly and enforcing them like law. I wasn't just dealing with a rogue HOA, I was dealing with an illegitimate regime pretending to have authority. And now I had the receipts. I contacted a local property rights attorney, handed over my video footage and documentation, and filed a formal complaint with the state HOA oversight office. By the time I was done, Craig and his clipboard gang were facing multiple legal challenges, and I was preparing to sue for damages. It was no longer just about a shed, it was about standing up for myself, and for every neighbor who had been bullied into silence. It wasn't long before the rest of the neighborhood started noticing something was off. At first, I thought I was the only one being targeted, but within a week of receiving my 5th bogus violation notice, I began hearing quiet grumblings from other homeowners. It started with my neighbor Sandra, who lived 2 doors down. She stopped me while I was walking my dog and asked, "Hey, did you get one of those weird letters about porch lighting?" I nodded, and she immediately rolled her eyes and said, "Mine says I'm in violation because I still have a fall wreath on my front door." In January. That's when the floodgates opened. Over the next few days, a steady stream of residents began sharing their own stories, absurd fines, intimidating letters, and Craig's heavy-handed tactics. One elderly couple had been fined $300 for having too many garden ornaments in their flower bed, specifically 3 small ceramic frogs and a decorative solar lamp. Another resident had been told their recycling bin disrupted visual consistency because it was blue instead of green, even though the city had issued it. A single mother, barely making ends meet, was fined $50 every week for inconsistent fence height, despite the fact that her fence had been standing for years untouched and hadn't changed an inch. It became clear that Craig and his little HOA regime weren't enforcing rules. They were inventing them, targeting people at random, and using the threat of fines or property liens to keep people compliant. And the worst part? Most people had just paid the fines out of fear, hoping to avoid confrontation or legal trouble. Once I realized how widespread the abuse was, I knew I had to escalate things beyond just defending myself. I sent out flyers and emails inviting homeowners to an informal meeting at my place. I expected maybe 5 or 6 people to show up. 23 came, and every single one had a story. We sat in my living room while I presented everything I had: video footage, HOA bylaw violations, expired board terms, and illegal rule amendments. There was silence for a moment after I finished, and then someone said, "So what can we do about it?" That question sparked the formation of a new neighborhood alliance. We weren't just fighting over sheds and mailboxes anymore. We were defending our right to live in our own homes without constant fear of harassment. We called ourselves the Homeowners for Accountability, and within a week, we had over 40 households involved. People began forwarding me their own HOA notices, taking pictures and recording interactions. Someone even found old meeting minutes where Craig had motioned to increase HOA dues by 25%, a change that had never been put to a community vote. Even worse, there were no financial records available showing where those increased dues had gone. The HOA website had been taken offline, and when residents requested documents, they were told the files were in transition. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a case of petty power trips. It was corruption. Plain and simple. Our next move was to hire a lawyer, someone who specialized in HOA abuse cases. Luckily, one of the members of our group, Maria, had a brother who was an attorney with exactly that background. He took one look at our compiled evidence and said, "This is one of the worst cases of HOA overreach I've ever seen." He helped us draft a formal cease and desist letter, which we sent to Craig and the entire board, demanding they stop enforcing any new violations and provide a full audit of HOA finances. Instead of cooperating, Craig doubled down. He issued a statement accusing me, and by extension the entire group, of spreading falsehoods to destabilize community harmony. He followed up with an official letter revoking my right to attend future HOA meetings due to disruptive behavior, despite the fact that I hadn't spoken at a single one since this mess started. That's when I released the fence video. One of Craig's loyal board members had been caught on my security camera climbing halfway over my 6-foot backyard fence with a flashlight, apparently trying to photograph the shed under cover of night. The footage was crystal clear. We posted it in the neighborhood group chat and emailed it to every homeowner. It went viral locally in less than a day. People were furious. Residents who had previously stayed silent began openly questioning the board's actions. Someone even forwarded the video to a local news outlet, and within a week, a reporter contacted me for an interview. The moment the story broke on the evening news, local HOA accused of harassment, homeowner captures board member trespassing on camera, everything changed. The balance of power began to shift. What started as a lonely, infuriating battle over a shed had grown into a full-blown neighborhood uprising, and I was no longer fighting alone. The days following the news story were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Suddenly, I wasn't just the guy with the shed. I was being hailed as the voice of reason, the reluctant leader of a neighborhood rebellion that had been simmering for years. People I had never spoken to before waved at me on the street, stopped to thank me, and shared their own frustrations. The group we had started, Homeowners for Accountability, exploded in size overnight. We had over 70 members by the end of the week, and someone offered to create a private website so we could organize, share documents, and plan next steps. Meanwhile, Craig and the rest of the board scrambled to control the narrative. They sent out a glossy 4-page newsletter titled, "Preserving Our Community's Values," which, rather than addressing any of the allegations, attempted to paint our group as a disruptive faction spreading misinformation. It might have worked, if we hadn't already circulated the Bodycam footage, the trespassing video, and a detailed timeline of their violations to every mailbox in the neighborhood. Their reputation was crumbling faster than they could spin it. But despite the momentum, I knew we had to be methodical. Emotion might have sparked this fire, but facts would win the war. With the help of our lawyer, we submitted a formal demand for records under the Davis-Sterling Act, a California law that, among other things, requires HOAs to make financial and board records accessible to any member upon request. When the HOA ignored the demand, we filed a civil complaint in small claims court. Our lawyer also sent a formal letter to the city attorney and local code enforcement, including evidence of potential misappropriation of HOA funds. That part was critical. During our investigation, we discovered that over $15,000 in landscaping fees had been paid to a contractor with no license on file, someone who, as it turned out, was Craig's cousin. Another $6,800 had gone toward community event planning, but no events had been held in over a year. It became clear this wasn't just about enforcement abuse, it was financial exploitation. Our group pooled together for a forensic accountant, who agreed to review the past 3 years of HOA budgets. What she found was damning: inconsistent entries, missing invoices, and large withdrawals with no documented purpose. We now had proof of not only harassment and overreach, but actual financial misconduct. But even as we prepared to take legal action, the harassment didn't stop. In fact, it escalated. One morning I found a citation taped to my car windshield, a car that was parked in my own driveway, claiming it obstructed the visual flow of the cul-de-sac. That same week, 3 members of our group received threatening anonymous letters warning them to back off or suffer the consequences. One woman had her trash bin stolen. Another's outdoor security camera was smashed. Someone even threw eggs at my garage door late one night, but unfortunately for them, I had just upgraded my home security system to include full perimeter motion detection and high-definition night vision. I turned the footage over to the police and filed a report. They couldn't prove who did it, but I had my suspicions. It didn't matter though. Every petty act of retaliation only strengthened our case and drew more support from neighbors who were finally seeing the true face of the board. Eventually, we organized a formal petition to recall the entire HOA board. According to our governing documents, we needed signatures from 25% of homeowners to initiate a recall vote. We collected nearly 50% in 4 days. When we submitted the petition, Craig tried to delay the process, claiming procedural inconsistencies. But we had legal oversight, documentation, and public pressure on our side. When that failed, he attempted to call an emergency meeting to change the bylaws and raise the threshold for recalls, but by then no one was listening to him. The community had turned. Even former allies of the board began distancing themselves, worried about the legal fallout. A local reporter followed up on the initial story and published a deep-dive exposé on the situation, complete with quotes from homeowners, screenshots of citations, and a copy of the trespassing footage. The final blow came when the city launched a formal investigation into the HOA's finances, opening a review of their nonprofit status and requiring an independent audit. For the first time, Craig didn't show up to a board meeting. He resigned 2 days later by email. Craig's resignation came not with an apology, but with a short, self-pitying email in which he blamed a toxic and ungrateful community for forcing his hand. There was no mention of the financial discrepancies, no acknowledgement of the abuse he and his board had inflicted, and certainly no attempt to make amends. But we didn't need a confession. The damage had been done, and so had the documentation. With Craig gone and the rest of the board either under investigation or quietly stepping down, the community held a special election. For the first time in years, the process was transparent, democratic, and inclusive. Candidates were required to present written platforms, and each homeowner received a ballot with clear instructions and deadlines. I had no intention of running for office, but I did volunteer to help organize the transition. We partnered with a nonprofit that specialized in HOA reform to ensure that the election followed proper procedure. The turnout was massive. Over 80% of eligible homeowners voted. The new board was composed of people who had lived in the community for years and had no interest in abusing power. One was a retired teacher, another a small business owner, and one was even a former city auditor, which proved invaluable during the next stage of our fight: financial accountability. Within weeks of taking office, the new board opened the books. They invited every homeowner to attend open meetings, real ones with minutes, agendas, and budget reports. The findings confirmed everything our group had suspected and more. Craig and his allies had spent nearly $30,000 on personal reimbursements for consulting services, vague landscaping charges, and event coordination that had no receipts or deliverables attached. Even more troubling were the unrecorded cash withdrawals, over $10,000 taken from the HOA's petty fund over the course of 2 years with no explanation. The board's new treasurer filed a report with the county's fraud division, and our attorney submitted supplemental documentation to support an official investigation. While criminal charges were still being evaluated, the civil side moved swiftly. A judge issued a preliminary injunction barring Craig and 2 other former board members from serving on any HOA board in the state for 5 years. That alone felt like justice. But the real victory came when the court ordered restitution. They were required to repay a portion of the misused funds directly to the HOA's operating budget. As for me, life slowly began returning to normal, though normal looked a little different now. The shed that started it all still stood in my backyard, untouched, unbothered, a small monument to what we had gone through. I installed new solar lights along the fence and planted a few rose bushes nearby, not because I needed to, but because I could. 4 months I had felt like a stranger on my own property, walking on eggshells, dreading every knock at the door or envelope in the mailbox. That fear had been replaced by something far more powerful: community. The same neighbors who once waved silently now stopped to chat. We held monthly gatherings, started a shared tool library, and launched a community watch group, not to spy on each other but to support and protect each other. What had started as a defensive alliance had grown into something healthy and self-sustaining. We weren't just resisting corruption anymore, we were building something better in its place. One day I received a handwritten note on my doorstep from Jake, the retired cop who had first caught Craig's crew trespassing during their botched attempt to dismantle the shed. It said, "Glad you stood your ground. People like you are the reason neighborhoods like this survive." I kept that note on my fridge, right next to a copy of the front page of the local paper with the headline, "Homeowner Stands Up to HOA, Sparks Major Reform." I didn't do it for recognition, but it was a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't just protect you, it empowers others. I still wore the body cam from time to time, more out of habit than necessity. Part of me stayed alert, knowing how quickly things can spiral when power goes unchecked. But for the most part, peace had returned. The HOA was finally what it was supposed to be, a system of neighbors working together, not ruling over each other. And all it took to get there was a shed, a camera, and the willingness to say, "Enough." Rebuilding trust in the wake of chaos proved to be a slower process than removing the bad actors. Even after Craig and his cronies were out, their shadow lingered, traces of paranoia, hesitation, and division among neighbors who had once kept their heads down to avoid becoming targets. For years, fear had been the operating principle of our HOA. Fear of being fined, fear of retaliation, fear of speaking out. So while the new board's first actions were practical, revising the bylaws, publishing transparent budgets, eliminating arbitrary fines, the real work was emotional. We needed to remind people that a neighborhood isn't supposed to feel like a surveillance state. It should feel like home. I remember attending the first community cookout under the new board's leadership. It was a modest affair, grilled hot dogs, folding chairs, a rented bounce house, but the vibe was completely different from the forced, awkward events Craig used to organize. People actually talked, laughed. Kids ran through sprinklers on front lawns, music played from Bluetooth speakers, and for the first time in a long time, no one was looking over their shoulder. I watched from my porch for a while, soaking it all in, until a neighbor named Darnell waved me over. I'd barely spoken to him before all this, but that night we ended up talking for over an hour about everything from HOA politics to barbecue recipes. That moment stuck with me, not because it was dramatic but because it was normal. We were finally getting back to normal. Meanwhile, the legal process dragged on. Though we had won the civil case and forced restitution, the criminal investigations moved much slower. The former treasurer eventually admitted, under pressure, that she had signed off on multiple undocumented reimbursements, including checks written directly to Craig. She claimed she had been manipulated, told that everything was board-approved, even when meetings had never taken place. Her cooperation helped the authorities build a stronger case, but I could tell it weighed heavily on her. She sent a letter of apology to the board and to the community, and though some were hesitant to forgive, many appreciated the gesture. After all, part of rebuilding meant learning to distinguish between malicious intent and honest failure. We didn't need more punishment, we needed accountability and change. Still, the state's investigation into HOA governance violations led to broader reforms. A new regulation was introduced requiring all HOAs in our county to conduct third-party financial audits every 2 years and to publish all meeting minutes within 10 business days. It might not sound like much, but it was a significant shift in a system that had operated unchecked for too long. Personally, I found myself in a strange place. 4 months I had operated in crisis mode, every day defined by fighting back, gathering evidence, filing reports, and rallying the community. Now that the fire had been put out, I wasn't sure what role I played anymore. I turned down an invitation to run for a seat on the new board, preferring instead to support from the sidelines. I continued to attend meetings, lend my research skills, and help draft clearer, more homeowner-friendly language for the updated bylaws. It felt good to contribute without being in the spotlight. I also got involved in a county-level task force looking into HOA abuse complaints, where I met others who had gone through similar nightmares. One man from the next town over told me his HOA tried to evict him over a tomato plant. A woman had spent 3 years in litigation over her choice of fence stain. It was comforting, and infuriating, to realize this problem wasn't just ours. But it also reinforced the importance of what we'd accomplished. Our neighborhood had become a case study in standing up, speaking out, and reclaiming power from those who never deserved it. And the shed? Still standing. Still solid. Sometimes I catch myself glancing at it and smiling, not because it's just a structure but because of what it represents. The absurdity of that first violation notice, the trespassing, the retaliation, all of it had come to a head over this one simple, functional thing. And yet, in fighting to protect it, I had helped preserve something far more valuable. A sense of fairness, safety, and dignity for the people who call this place home. Every so often, someone new moves into the neighborhood, and when they ask about HOA rules, they're often met with a chuckle and a story. Ask the guy with the shed. They don't always know the full history, but they know enough that the rules now make sense, the board is accountable, and this community knows how to stand up for itself when it counts. As months passed and the dust finally settled, I began to realize just how deeply the entire ordeal had changed me, not just in how I saw the HOA but in how I saw authority, community, and even myself. Before all this, I was just another quiet homeowner, someone who paid his dues on time, waved politely to neighbors, and minded his own business. I never saw myself as the kind of person who challenges systems or organizes community resistance. That was someone else. Activists, politicians, lawyers. But somewhere between that first aggressive knock on my door and the court's final ruling, I had crossed a line internally, from passive participant to engaged citizen. It wasn't just about defending a shed anymore, it was about confronting what happens when small power goes unchecked, when good people are bullied into silence by the illusion of authority. And the truth is, it's easy to ignore abuse when it's not directed at you. That's why so many people stayed quiet during Craig's reign, not because they were cowards but because they didn't yet see the pattern. Once they did, once the trespassing, the fake violations, and the shady finances became undeniable, they stood up. And standing beside them was one of the most fulfilling experiences of my life. We didn't win because I had a camera. We won because people remembered they had a voice, and a right to use it. Ironically, what helped me see all this more clearly wasn't another HOA meeting or legal milestone. It was a simple walk through the neighborhood one quiet Sunday morning. I took the long route, past the park, down the row of older homes near the creek, places I rarely visited before all this. I noticed things I never paid attention to before. The way Mr. Patel always arranged his flower pots with military precision, the hand-painted mailbox in front of the Lopez's house, the wind chimes that chimed softly on Marissa's porch. These weren't violations or aesthetic inconsistencies. They were little expressions of identity, the things that make a neighborhood feel lived in, loved, and personal. I passed the house of the single mom who'd once been fined for her fence and saw that she'd finally repainted it. Bright blue, cheerful, completely against the old board's preferred earth tones. It looked great. And no one cared. No fines, no notices, just a fence exactly as it should be. That moment hit me harder than I expected. It was a visual reminder of what we'd changed and what it meant. Not just freedom from harassment but permission to simply exist in peace. The shed, which had once been a battleground, gradually returned to being just a shed. I'd replaced the broken lock, repainted the door, and installed a solar panel on the roof to power the small work light inside. On some weekends, I found myself spending hours out there, fixing garden tools, organizing old gear, or just tinkering with small projects. Sometimes neighbors would wander over, especially the kids, curious to see what I was building. I started keeping a couple of extra chairs out back, and before long, it became an informal hangout spot. No HOA permission needed. We even hosted a neighborhood shed party one Saturday evening, potluck style, with folding tables set up under string lights and music playing softly in the background. It wasn't about the shed anymore. It was about community, memory, and the sense that we'd all earned the right to enjoy this space together. Even people who had once sided with Craig eventually came around. One of them, a man named Dennis who had served briefly on the board, stopped by one afternoon with a six-pack and a sheepish look on his face. He admitted he'd supported Craig early on because he thought, Someone needed to enforce order, but he hadn't realized just how out of hand things had gotten. I appreciated the honesty. We shared a drink and talked about everything: his regrets, my anger, and the strange way power changes people when no one's watching. That conversation reminded me of something important. Not everyone who goes along with injustice does so out of malice. Sometimes it's fear, habit, or just not knowing better. That doesn't excuse it, but it does mean there's room for growth, for understanding, for redemption. If this whole mess had taught me anything, it was that you can't fix a broken system by burning everything down. You have to rebuild with intention, with clarity, and with the belief that people, given the right environment, can do better. While our neighborhood slowly redefined itself, word of what we had done began to spread beyond our little subdivision. It started with a few blog posts on HOA reform forums and Facebook groups, but before long I was getting emails from people all over the state, and even from other parts of the country. Some were homeowners facing eerily similar harassment, others were newly elected HOA board members looking to avoid the mistakes ours had made. I hadn't set out to be anyone's advisor, but I did my best to respond to every message. Sometimes that meant forwarding legal resources, other times it meant just listening to someone vent after months of being ignored by their own community. The sheer number of people dealing with HOA abuse stunned me. I had always assumed our situation was an anomaly, a rare case of authority run amok. But it wasn't. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. Across the country, thousands of neighborhoods were being micromanaged, fined, intimidated, and even sued by the very organizations that were supposed to protect them. In many cases, these boards operated with almost no oversight, shielded by vague rules, apathetic members, and the simple fact that most people don't have the time, money, or emotional bandwidth to fight back. That realization lit a new kind of fire in me, not the defensive anger I'd felt when this all began, but something steadier. A sense of responsibility. I knew I couldn't fix every broken HOA, but maybe I could help more people feel like they weren't crazy or alone. At the suggestion of one of the new board members, Janine, the former city auditor, I started documenting our story in a more organized way. Not just the shed incident but the whole arc. The fake citations, the legal battles, the reform effort, and the rebuilding of community afterward. She suggested turning it into a guidebook, something other neighborhoods could use as a blueprint. At first I laughed at the idea. I wasn't a writer, just a homeowner who got pushed too far. But once I sat down to organize my notes, it all came rushing back. The dread of those early violation notices, the adrenaline of confrontation, the long nights reviewing bylaws and emails, the neighbor meetings filled with nervous energy, and finally the moment when things began to turn, when silence became solidarity. Writing it all down was therapeutic in a way I didn't expect. It allowed me to process everything at a slower, more reflective pace. By the time I finished the first draft, it was over 100 pages long. I called it The Shed That Started It All, a homeowner's guide to fighting HOA abuse and reclaiming community. To my surprise, the guide started circulating. Someone uploaded it to a national HOA reform subreddit, and from there it took off. I got emails from journalists, housing advocates, even a city council member from another state asking if I'd be willing to speak at a public forum on HOA transparency. It was surreal. Just a year earlier, I'd been dodging harassment and wondering if I'd have to take down my shed to avoid legal trouble. Now, I was being asked to share lessons learned with people trying to draft new legislation. And while I had no illusions of being an expert, I realized that sometimes lived experience carries more weight than legal jargon. People weren't looking for polished presentations, they were looking for real stories, real examples, real hope. I agreed to speak at a few online panels, and each time I did, I emphasized one point above all else. You don't need to be a lawyer, a politician, or a hero to make a difference. You just need to pay attention, ask questions, and stand your ground when something doesn't feel right. Back at home, life continued with a newfound sense of rhythm. The HOA, now fully restructured, was running smoothly. Meetings were collaborative, budgets transparent, and disputes rare. More importantly, people participated, not out of fear but out of interest. It was astonishing how simple the formula turned out to be. Respect homeowners, invite feedback, and don't treat every mailbox or fence like a threat to civilization. We weren't perfect, no community ever is, but we had built something far better than what existed before. And while my days of battling rogue board members were hopefully behind me, I stayed involved in small ways. Mentoring new board members, reviewing occasional rule proposals, and yes, still answering the occasional email from someone halfway across the country saying, "I read your story. I thought I was alone. Thank you." Those messages reminded me that even something as mundane as a backyard shed can become a symbol, not of conflict, but of courage, persistence, and the power of a community that refuses to be silent. In the quiet moments, early mornings with coffee on the porch or late nights tinkering in the shed, I sometimes reflect on how a simple structure, barely 10 by 12 feet, became the catalyst for such massive change. It's strange to think that something so ordinary could have triggered a journey that reshaped not only my neighborhood but my entire sense of who I am and what matters. At the start, I had no grand mission. I wasn't trying to be brave or make a point. I just wanted to store my tools without getting harassed. But once the first citation came, followed by trespassers, threats, and mounting pressure, I realized something many people don't until it's too late. If you let bullies chip away at your dignity 1 inch at a time, eventually they take the whole yard. That realization was the turning point. And from that moment forward, I stopped treating my situation like a minor inconvenience and started treating it like what it really was: a fight for basic fairness, autonomy, and respect. Not just for me but for every neighbor who had been pushed around, silenced, or manipulated under the guise of community standards. Looking back, it wasn't the shed that was ever the real issue. It was control. The board didn't care about the aesthetics, they cared about obedience. The shed just happened to be the line I wouldn't cross, the hill I chose to stand on. But now that shed symbolizes something far bigger. The moment one voice cracked the dam wide open, the beginning of a collective awakening. Even now, I sometimes catch people glancing toward it when they pass by, not with suspicion but with a kind of quiet respect. They know the story. They remember what it meant. And that shared memory, that unspoken understanding, is what binds us stronger now than any rulebook ever could. You can feel it in the way people wave to each other, the spontaneous chats that happen on sidewalks, the way kids roam more freely than before. We're not just living here, we belong here. We earned that sense of belonging through struggle, solidarity, and sheer refusal to be intimidated. And for me personally, something deeper shifted. I used to keep to myself, focused on my job, my yard, my routine. I didn't know most of my neighbors' names. Now, I know nearly everyone on my street and several blocks beyond. I've helped organize block parties, cleanup days, and even a small neighborhood garden near the park. I've seen people come out of their shells, build friendships, and contribute ideas to keep our community growing. We even started a monthly civic dinner, where residents gather, share food, and talk about anything from city planning to local school programs. I would have laughed at the idea a few years ago, but now it feels like the most natural thing in the world. We became more than a collection of houses. We became a community because we remembered that living near each other isn't the same as living with each other. And still, whenever I hear a story in the news about an overreaching HOA elsewhere, some poor soul being fined for having too many sunflowers or told to remove a flag or repaint a door, it reminds me that this fight isn't over everywhere. The systems that allow petty tyranny to thrive still exist in too many places. But if our story can help even one person push back, one community hold their board accountable, or one official reconsider how HOAs are allowed to operate, then it was worth it. I've even had conversations with city council members and housing policy advocates about how to create better checks and balances. Maybe someday, legislation will catch up with the reality homeowners face. Until then, it's up to ordinary people to speak out when something feels wrong, to support each other, and to remember that community should never be a weapon. It should be a promise. As for me, I don't plan on running for office or launching a nationwide reform campaign. I've had my chapter and I'm grateful for the growth it brought. Now, I'm more interested in tending to my tomatoes, repainting the porch swing, or helping a neighbor repair their fence. But if someone knocks on my door with a citation in hand and a question in their eyes, I'll offer them a chair, a cup of coffee, and the same answer every time: you're not alone. Let's take a look together. It's funny how the things that seem small in the moment, an unfair citation, a broken latch on a shed, a quiet act of defiance, can grow into turning points that reshape your world. Now, standing at the edge of it all, I see the full arc not just of a conflict, but of a personal awakening. If there's one thing I've learned through this entire journey, it's that power, especially small, localized power, is only dangerous when it's left unchallenged. And in the context of a homeowners association, it's easy to dismiss the damage as trivial. It's just grass height, right? Just a mailbox color. Just a shed. But what they don't tell you is how quickly those little rules become mechanisms of control when applied unequally or with malice. What starts as a simple standard can turn into surveillance, harassment, even social exile. And the people enforcing those standards? They're often not villains. They're neighbors who let their desire for order overpower their empathy. That's what makes it so hard to fight, because it's not some distant authority bearing down on you. It's the guy who waves to you on trash day. The woman who compliments your garden. And that closeness, that false sense of familiarity, can make the injustice feel sharper, more personal. But that's also where the hope lives. Because if power can grow out of a mailbox complaint, so can resistance and so can community. We all go through moments that test who we are and what we're willing to stand for. This was mine. And while I'd never wish this kind of battle on anyone, I also wouldn't erase it. Because on the other side of it, I found something I didn't even know I was missing. I found connection, purpose, and a deep, steady belief in the value of showing up, not just when it's convenient but when it's hard. Before all this, I used to think community was mostly about geography. You lived near people, shared the same roads, got the same mail. That was it. But now I understand that community is a choice, a series of active decisions to care, to listen, to protect, and to include. It's built in the little things, checking on your neighbor when their car hasn't moved, leaving muffins at someone's door after a hard week, volunteering to walk the block with someone who's worried about security. These things matter. They anchor us. And when something threatens them, be it bad policy or unchecked authority, it's worth speaking up even if your voice shakes. The shed still stands, weathered now by a few seasons of sun and wind, but strong. It's no longer the symbol of defiance it once was. It doesn't need to be. Its mere presence says enough. Every now and then, someone new to the neighborhood will ask about it, curious why it seems to be such a point of pride. I usually smile, shrug, and say something like, "It's just a shed with a long story." But if they stick around, if they really want to know, I'll tell them the whole thing. I'll show them the folder of violation notices, the footage from the Bodycam, the community newsletter announcing the new board, the framed class action settlement letter hanging in my hallway like a diploma. I'll show them the emails I still receive from people in other cities, other states, all of them fighting their own version of the same battle. And most of all, I'll tell them how a bunch of regular people, accountants, teachers, single parents, retirees, banded together not just to win but to rebuild. Because that's the part I'm most proud of. Not that we pushed out the bad actors, but that we filled the vacuum they left behind with care, vision, and shared responsibility. There's a peace now that I didn't expect. It's not the kind of peace that comes from victory or even vindication. It's quieter than that. It's the peace of knowing you did something that mattered. That when the moment called for courage, you didn't back down. That when you saw your community being manipulated, you didn't look away. It's the peace of sleeping soundly in a home you fought to protect. Not with fists but with truth, persistence, and a few neighbors who believed in something better. And maybe that's the real legacy of it all. Not the legal win, not the guidebook, not the viral forums or interviews. Just this. The reminder that even when you feel small, even when the odds are against you, you are never powerless. Sometimes all it takes is one shed, one voice, one spark. And if you can hold your ground when everything tells you to move, that's how change begins. That's how communities heal. And that's how you reclaim not just your property, but your place in the world.